Let us get started. Okay. We are going to start with a 2-minute video. Set it up. Let me first get it out here. Oops, I forgot to share sound just a second. Doesn't work that way otherwise. Okay. We're going to be learning tonight about Eliezer ben Yehuda, among other personalities. And as such, I wanted to show you, this is just a 2-minute clip from the National Library about Ben Yehuda. I'm sure you all are aware that he's the father of modern Hebrew. Little background here, and then we'll get into the topic.
Did you know that there was a time when people didn't speak Hebrew, and it almost became extinct? Hebrew is one of the few languages that almost disappeared and was brought back to life. But who rescued the Hebrew language? Who revived Hebrew? Following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and the Jewish exile from Israel, Hebrew ceased to be a spoken language as the Jewish people began speaking the local languages of their new home countries. Hebrew remained the sacred language used for prayer and religious study. Early cultural Zionists, who sought to create a Jewish homeland with a distinct Jewish culture, recognized the need to transform Hebrew from a language only used in religious study and practice to an everyday language uniting Jews around the world. This inspired Eliezer ben Yehuda to bring Hebrew back to life. Eliezer ben Yehuda took Hebrew words from ancient texts and used them as the foundation for modern Hebrew words to describe modern concepts and objects. Despite his efforts, Eliezer ben Yehuda faced a lot of resistance from people who believed that Hebrew should only be used for religious study and prayer. In 1890, Eliezer ben Yehuda founded the Vaad HaLashon, known today as the Academy of Hebrew Language, which remains responsible for developing and monitoring Hebrew vocabulary. Between 1918 and 1948, thousands of new Hebrew words were created, and the number of people speaking Hebrew grew exponentially, inspiring the Zionist Congress to declare Hebrew as the official language of the Zionist movement in 1904. Eliezer ben Yehuda did not live to see Hebrew become the official language of the State of Israel when it was established in 1948. Thanks to Eliezer ben Yehuda's efforts, Hebrew is now a living and evolving modern language. There are now over 9 million people speaking Hebrew, both in religious ceremonies and on the street. We invite you to become an honorary member of the Vaad HaLashon to understand why Hebrew is so important to Israeli culture, to create new Hebrew words, and to familiarize yourself with some popular Hebrew words.
Okay, so what I want to do tonight, we're going to talk about Eliezer ben Yehuda, give some background, some history about him. Also, we're going to talk about the Academy for Hebrew Language, which he founded. We'll get to that. And also to discuss the importance of language when it comes to keeping a people connected. I'm leaving it kind of a little open there. We'll see. So firstly, he's born in Lithuania, 1858. And he goes through a traditional cheder and yeshiva system, very much like the people of his time. But he also was exposed to secular studies, nationalist thoughts, which will sound similar to some other people we've discussed. Remember, we're talking about the early Zionist movement. We've talked about some of the rabbis. We've talked about some of the secular leaders, such as Pinsker. And one of the keys, is not necessarily a key, but one of the things that will tie all these people together eventually is the language. So that's why I wanted to get into him as well, because he was also very much into reading. Ben Yehuda is very much into reading Russian revolutionaries, the various works of the people, European linguists, and he saw language. This is why it's important to mention now. He saw language as a key to national revival. Now, if you remember, when we talked about, about people like of Mahalaver, of Rhinus, they saw the Torah, of course, as being an integral part of the basis for establishing the land of Israel, eventually what will become Medinat Yisrael. Others looked at it as just we needed a nationalist movement. But he felt, Ben Yehuda, that one of the key one of the keys to revival of a national people is the revival of the language of the people. While he was studying in Paris, he made a decision. His decision was that he was going to single-handedly try to bring the language of Hebrew back to being a spoken language. That had not disappeared, obviously, because it's been used in terms of tefillah, prayer, in terms of many other areas, in the Torah, of course, in the commentaries. But that's where it was relegated to. It wasn't the spoken language. The Jews spoke, for the most part, the languages of their host countries. Most notably, of course, the Jews of Eastern Europe were speaking Yiddish, a derivative of German. And he wanted to change it to be the spoken vernacular of the Jewish people, because he also is aware of this whole movement of moving to Israel in the early days of Aliyah, and the different movements of Chivat Zion, Chobabei Zion. And he felt that, yes, you can have the Torah, yes, you can have the secular reasons, and yes, you can have the national. What's going to be one of the Mechanem Meshutaf, the common denominators for all these people? And he felt it would be language. I did a little research, and I'm going to just read you like 3 or 4 paragraphs of what it is that a common language does for people. It's the way it came up for my reading. It talks about the Italian language, Italian people, but it applies. It seems across the board. But so, like you say, when I say Italian, it makes no difference. I'm just going to read this to you. A common language does far more than allow people to exchange information. It creates a shared inner world of memory, emotion, humor, and meaning that binds individuals in a people. It binds individuals into a people and links them to their past. First, and he gives 4 points. Language creates immediate human connection. When people share a language, they share instinctive ways of expressing feeling, the tone of a complaint, the warmth of a greeting, the rhythm of a joke. These cannot be fully translated. An Italian speaking Italian does not merely convey content. He signals belonging. Just pause here for a second. For any of you who have flown, and you've flown not on El Al, or you've flown in El Al, and then you go into whatever city you go to where you were visiting, and you hear, for the most part, you're hearing English, maybe hearing a couple, maybe Spanish, depending if you're in the United States, or French if you're in Canada. And then what happens? You come back to the airport, you get to the El Al gate, and now all of a sudden you're starting to hear Hebrew from the people working behind the counter, and you hear people speaking Hebrew as they're getting out, and you already feel the connection. And I mean, I'm speaking for myself. That's how I felt every single time. I feel every time I go to the United States. When I'm back at the gate, ready to go to my El Al flight before it even starts to board, I already feel something there because of the language. The listener hears not just meaning, but familiarity. This person comes from the same human world as I do. Secondly, language encodes a distinct cultural logic. Every language carries assumptions about family, honor, time, food, authority, and beauty. Italian, for example, is saturated with the vocabulary of family life, place, gesture, and emotion. The language itself expresses flavors and relational nuance. Third, a shared language creates direct access to history. When Italians read Dante or Machiavelli or even popular folk songs, they're not encountering only their past. They are not encountering their past through a translator's filter. The words resonate with familiar sounds and structures. The past does not need to feel foreign. It feels ancestral. I love that line. What does that mean? Assume for a moment you all speak French. Let's use Spanish because I can get by in Spanish. Okay, and I start to tell you the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus of Egypt, in Spanish. And okay, I'm explaining it. You're hearing the language that's coming through, but it's still missing a step. And that step is hearing it in the original Hebrew, whether it's the psukim from Tanakh or someone speaking and telling you in Ivrit the story. Automatically, that language is no longer just a foreign language. It's part of your history. It's part of your ancestry. Number 4, language preserves collective memory. Idioms, proverbs, expressions are fossils of historical experience. Through everyday speech, history seeps into the present. And finally, a common language sustains peoplehood over time and space. Italians from different regions or from the diaspora, a different customer outlook. but the shared language allows them to recognize each other as part of a single story. In short, a common language is not merely a tool of communication, it is a vessel of identity. And this is very much what Ben Yehuda felt, how he approached wanting to make Hebrew the national language, reviving it so that people would speak it, because it's not only to give them a common, remember, people are coming at this time of history already. They're coming from Europe, they're coming from Russia, they're coming from other countries. Some are starting to trickle in from the northern African continent, the north part of the African continent, and they're bringing a whole group of different languages with. And he felt that the language is not only going to tie them together now, but it's also going to tie them to their history. Obviously, part of the problem was that there are words that didn't exist in Hebrew yet. But because Hebrew is such a rich language, we're going to get to how he was able to do that and change literally the history of how we speak today. He arrives in what was called Ottoman Palestine in 1881, and he sets about to do this project almost with some form of what people refer to as messianic zeal, that he felt that this not only was going to bring people together, not only tie them to their past, but he wasn't a religious man, but the idea of maybe the messianic time, whatever that meant to him. And he produced what he called the first Hebrew child. Let me explain to you what that is. I'm not going to give you all. There are many stories about this. I'm going to give you one or two brief ones. When his first child was born, he prohibited anyone in the room with his child speaking any language other than Hebrew. His wife, no one was allowed to speak to this child in any language except Hebrew, to the point where he was closing off his window so the baby would not hear the birds chirping, because that was a language as far as he was concerned. He wanted 100% Hebrew, nothing else. One day he came home and he found his wife reading a story to the baby in Yiddish. It was a baby, not a little child, baby. And the story is that he kind of went ballistic, because how dare you put Yiddish into his brain? He needs to hear only Hebrew, only Hebrew, only Hebrew. I will tell you, as a person who loves language and has been, thank God, learned some over the years, that complete immersion is really one of the only ways you can truly learn a language in the best way. Doesn't mean to the extent that you don't listen to the birds chirping. That's okay. But I'll give you one example. I had learned about 45 years ago. I still can read and write Russian, and I can understand some, but I used to be able to speak pretty well. I could carry on a conversation. I don't use it hardly ever. I mean, maybe once in a year I'll need to have a reason to have a few words. In order for me to get that back, it's back here somewhere. To get that back, I would need to be like in Moscow for 3 months and then completely immersed. There are people who their Hebrew is not so great, and then they go into a situation where they move into a community where they have no choice. They have to hear Hebrew. It's only Hebrew. So if a person, there's some people who just, no matter how many years they work on a language, they're never going to get it. It's just there are certain people. I can't do math. I can't do it well. Certain areas I can do, but most math, I'm not good at math. That's just who I am. So you can immerse me in a math school and all, it's not going to necessarily sink in. But for someone who has trouble with language, you can immerse them in the language. It's not going to necessarily make any difference. So it's not like, oh, if you have a perfect, complete immersion, you're going to learn Hebrew. It doesn't work that way. But it will definitely set you machsomim, like things of barriers in Israel, when a person proactively decides, they're going to get along with their home language, their original language, and not Hebrew. Person says, I can get along fine with English. By the way, you can. Doesn't mean it's a good thing. And not going to even try to learn Hebrew, no matter what your age. And I know for people, some people it's very difficult. I know, but I'm just saying, making a proactive decision without even trying is really closing off a lot of doors. And I've had this kind of conversation with many students over the years whose parents are not much into Hebrew speaking. And the kids say, look, my parents are fine. They get along fine with English. And I'm telling them, you got the army, you got university, you got jobs, you got life, you got so many doors you're closing when you proactively shut down the door to Ivrit. And where did it all start? It started with Eliezer ben Yehuda. What did he do? So besides just having the first Hebrew baby or Hebrew child, He started by editing and publishing and editing and publishing a couple of Hebrew newspapers. One was called Hatzvi, one was called Haor, the light. He coined thousands of neologisms. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I know the word neologisms or neologisms. I'm not sure. It means new words that are being coined. By the way, in every language, they have to come up with new words every year because when, let's say, go back just to the computer revolution, go back into even before the home computers, let's go into the 70s, in the infancy, mid 70s, let's say, they had to come up with names for various things, semiconductors and whatever the word or the terminology was. When they come up with a new procedure, a medical procedure, there's maybe terminology that's. I'm not talking about the body. The anatomy is the anatomy, but certain tools, certain whatever it might be. Every field has its language. And by the way, a person can be really good in one language. A person could speak fantastic Hebrew and then read a paragraph in a journal and not understand a word because it's on an area that has its own sub language. So he coined thousands and thousands of new words. He didn't just pick them out of the sky. One thing you have to understand is that's not how Hebrew works. It works based on the concept of what's called a shoresh. Shoresh being the root of a word, usually, but not always, it's 3 letters. Based on that, and for those of you who start to get the hives and start itching when you hear things like PL, Pual, Hifal, Nifal, Shvana, Shvanach, Milel, Milra, talk to me another time. I actually like this stuff. He worked for decades to come up with what became the very first dictionary of the Hebrew language. Many of us grew up with the yellow and blue little Ben Yehuda dictionary. And it was actually completed after he passed away. He did not complete it himself in his lifetime. Now, there's a modern day offshoot, as was mentioned in this video, of his earlier work. There exists today. I get emails from them too frequently, but they send out emails like once or twice a week at least. It's called the Academia Lashon HaIvrit, or the Academy of the Hebrew Language. It was established by the Israeli government by law in 1953. And it was, quote, the supreme institution for scholarship on the Hebrew language in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem of Givat Ram campus. Its aims, I just again, research just to get some background for tonight. I'm going to read you 3 goals. Number 1, to assemble and research Hebrew language in all its layers through the ages. 2, to investigate the origin and development of the Hebrew tongue, and to direct the course of development of Hebrew in all areas, including vocabulary, grammar, writing, spelling, and transliteration. The amazing thing is you can send them emails. They respond very fast. Let's say, for example, you're not sure when to use the word limale or limalot. You're not sure, is this word with an aleph or is it with an ayin? And you've seen it both ways. What's the difference? And it's not just a translation service, but it'll try to say, is there a word for such and such? They are unbelievable. And they have weekly posts that talk about the history of a letter, of a word, and show you the difference in how it's used. It is a mind-boggling amount of information on their website. Sometimes it's actually quite humorous. Before Chagim, any Chag, even Tu B'Shvat, I shouldn't say even, but before every Chag, they have a little quiz for like 20 questions about the Chag, but it's about the words associated. So, oh, big deal. It's what's up. They have so many little subcategories of words. It's like, man, I really thought I knew something, but you get up there, you kind of feel a little weird. Anyways, so where did this come from? It came from in 1890 as Ben Yehuda is trying to revive the Hebrew language. He establishes what is known as the Vad HaLashon HaIvrit, or the Hebrew Language Committee. He was its first president. I can't say he was the only member, but I don't know, but it was a committee. As Hebrew became more and more of a spoken language in what was then called Palestine, it was adopted actually by, I'm going to change to how I'm going to say this. Assuming for a moment you're trying to infuse a country, a relatively new country. We're talking in the, it's not even a country yet. It's still Palestine, but there's plenty of Jews here. And there's what would be probably one of the best avenues to start to introduce a language. And also keep in mind, the best time to learn language is when you're young and little. And that is, they started to actually incorporate it into the educational system. By doing that, they were already infusing at a young age the language of Hebrew. Because you think about it, if parents, let's say you have parents that are 30s, there's that are 35 years old, and they speak Yiddish. They don't know the first thing about Hebrew. And now all of a sudden they're starting to see newspapers in Hebrew and they're not going to connect. So by putting it into the schools and putting it into the educational system, it became no different than learning another science or math or whatever it might be, but it became lashon, in the language. As you probably know, in Israel, in Kitot Yud Aleph and Yud Bet, 11th and 12th grade, you have Bagriyot, matriculation exams, and you have the exam in Lashon, in Hebrew language. You might think, well, it's like American having a test in English. Trust me, having taught taught a class and taught kids for Bagriyot to this, it's not a simple measure, even for people who that's their mother tongue. So he would also, besides having a committee for the Hebrew language, he also would publish bulletins, mini dictionaries, again, coined thousands of words that are in use today. Some of these words have fallen by the wayside over the years. I'll give you two examples. When we were, let's say, in grammar school, what do you call grammar school? Sefer Yesodi, elementary school, we learned that an airplane was called an aviron, and a table, like in school, a desk was called a machteva, the word lichtov. So the word aviron you almost never hear. You hear matos from the word latus, which means to fly. Now matos is an airplane. Machteva, I actually by accident used one time here when I started teaching. The kids had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. So I pointed to it. They said, shulchan means table. So over time, certain words have fallen by the wayside. I do remember at my first year in Shalavim, I went into the kitchen. There were lots of oranges, and there weren't any on the table. So I went into the kitchen. I asked for a tapuach zahav. Because a tapuz is the word for orange, which really means tapuach zahav. That's where it's from. But it's not a tapuz. It's called tapuz. So I asked for tapuach zahav, and I could still see the face of the lady who I asked. She's probably still laughing at me. Anyways, by the way, when it comes to language, you should never, ever, ever be afraid to make mistakes. It happens. People make mistakes. The people who have the worst dikduk or the worst grammar are people who grew up here. It grates on my ears sometimes to hear some of the ways that Israeli-born Israelis use Hebrew and whatever it is. But again, never be afraid to try. Never be afraid to make a mistake. And you can have a good laugh. And by the way, people will be very happy. And I've seen it myself. I'm talking to people. If I make a mistake on something, just as they're talking, they'll say the word the correct way to me, and I'll just throw it back in and make sure I use it the right way. That's fine. That's how you learn. If you're afraid to make a mistake on anything, you're not going to learn anything. Anyways, enough pontificating. Anyways, so as was mentioned in the brief video, also you can well imagine that there was a population that was not just opposed, but fiercely opposed to Ben Yehuda's goals. Because from their perspective, the purpose of Hebrew was Hebrew text, meaning Torah, Torah, Chumash, davening. That's what Hebrew was for. Everything else, no. So it drew the line, what became known as Lashon HaKodesh and Lashon HaKadoshim. The holy language or the language of the holy. The language of the holy was considered Yiddish, and the holy language was considered Hebrew. They felt that by putting Hebrew as a weekday, so to speak, a secular language, quote unquote, it was secularizing Hebrew, and people would lose the affinity for Hebrew, recognizing that it has to do with something holy. I can tell you, I've heard this from many people that will have, let's say, a newspaper, a Hebrew newspaper. I've been asked this question: can they take the Hebrew newspaper into the bathroom? Because it's Hebrew, and Hebrew is a holy language. Well, first of all, you can use haaretz in the bathroom, literally, but that's a different story. But unless there's psukim or something, it's Hebrew. It's not different than a textbook in Hebrew. So the point being is that in many people's minds, Hebrew automatically is something holy, which it is. But the argument being used in some circles was that they were going to secularize the Hebrew to the point where it won't mean anything special. And they felt it was a sacrilege, And they also felt that it's such a quote dead language. They referred to Hebrew as a dead language, would be able to be sustained in everyday life because it was for Torah, it was for davening, and that was it. But in the 1920s, not only is Hebrew being revived, but again, it's being institutionalized. I mentioned before, as far as schools, which already starts in the late 1800s. By 1920, it's official. Whatever the Mandate Palestine is being able to do. The press, public life, advertisements, signs, street signs, it's starting to pop up everywhere. This becomes a true linguistic revolution. There's no, and that's not an overstatement. That's not hyperbole. It's truly a revolution. Um, I don't think I knew one person, I'm sure there are others, but I personally knew one person who was a master of languages and actually knew Sanskrit. I don't know if it's spoken anywhere. Maybe it is. I've never really checked. But imagine that Sanskrit was the language of the Afghanis. I don't know if it is. And then all of a sudden, after no one speaking Sanskrit for 3,000 years, all of a sudden, in a matter of 20 years, the whole country is speaking Sanskrit. That's the same idea. You're bringing back what was considered a dead spoken language. Hebrew was not spoken for thousands of years. It was used. Keep in mind, there's a very big difference between a used language and a spoken language. In other words, you can open up a book that's an old Latin, take a look and just forget Latin. Open up Chaucer, anything in Chaucer, open up the Canterbury Tales, open up all these things that are written in Old English. There's a poem we learned in also when I was young called "Get Up and Bar the Door." It's written in Old English. I still actually remember it. It was very short. It was really funny too. But if you don't know what it is, look it up. It's called "Get Up and Bar the Door," and it's written in Old English. So English itself has morphed over the years. Words that we might use today didn't exist 10 years ago, 50 years ago. And words that were used a long time ago today have very different meanings. It's a living, breathing organism that, again, it ties people together to their history and to their roots and to the day-to-day life. But it was a very successful act, almost an act of engineering, and becomes one of the pillars of Zionist nation building. You don't have to go very far other than the beginning of the Torah to see how important language is, because we see it in the Tower of Babel, where you get the word to Babel, by the way. That's where it comes from, to Babylon, because not Babylon, Babylon, because the Hashem it confused the people's languages as they're building this tower, because it starts off in that parak, Vayu, it says they were Safa Achat, they were of one language. That's how they all communicated. That's what unified them. So this was an incredible feat by a person who was headstrong into this idea this would help make a difference in the Yeshuva Yashan, the early days of what we'll call in English just the Aliyah movement, and then eventually in building of a state. And it came true. It's exactly what happened. I just want to, as they say, go back for a second. I don't like using the circle back because it was overused in the administration of the last president. The Hebrew Academy for Language. If you have any interest in the language at all, at some point, I recommend going on their website. You don't even have to remember that. Say Hebrew Academy or Hebrew Language Academy. Anything you want to write in, you'll find it. They have thousands of short articles and explanations. What happens if I hear somebody say, if someone corrects me or I read something that I thought was this way, but it's that way, I'll go into the first thing I do is start with their website. We have many communities have people within their community who are absolute masters of not just of Hebrew, but of the dikduk, of the grammar. And so I had a question the other day. There's something, I'm not going to explain the whole background, but in Hebrew, there's something called nasog achor. Nasog achor in the Torah, in Tanakh, means that if you have a one-syllable word preceded by a multi-syllable word, then the multi-syllable word pushes the accent on that word goes back one. So I came across a word that I say every day in davening, and I say it one way because of that. I looked in Tehillim and I say, oh, the accent is not moved back. It stays where it's supposed to be. The word is lemoshav lo. I was always saying lemoshav lo because by rules of Tanakh, it's a single syllable word, lo. The word before it is lemoshav, so it should be lemoshav. So he pushes it back one. That's not what happens. Probably the best example I can give you of that is coming up shortly in Parshat Shavuot, not that soon, in a few weeks. You'll see two psukim that start the same way, but they're pronounced differently. One will say v'asuli. It's not v'asuli. It's v'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. You'll make for me a tabernacle, and I will dwell in them. Why is it v'asuli? Because the word li is one syllable. The word v'asu is two. So it moves it back to word v'asu. So it's v'asuli li mikdash. But then it's v'asu mishkan. It's not v'asu mishkan because it's multi-syllable. If you're lost on this, it's okay. I just wanted to tell you that there's millions of these little ideas and points that didn't escape Ben Yehuda. That was part of his writing as well. It was part of his giving birth to the modern day Hebrew language. And what he did was, of course, the only source he could really use, the main source for all Hebrew is Tanakh. So when you'll find a word and you're not sure what it means, if you could figure out the shoresh or the root of the word, that will almost always help you to determine what it means. Sometimes there'll be words that say that I don't have a clue why they're connected. I'll give you one. I did this in a class recently, but it wasn't this class. When you talk about your over here where you put the tefillin, this part here, your bicep, in Hebrew is called the kiboret. Kuf bet vav resh taf, kiboret. Okay. The shoresh is kever, which means grave. What in the world could the bicep or the kiboret have to do with kever? So kever technically we translate into grave, but really all it means is a mound because it was after a person was buried, they would make a mound on top of it to signify that there was a burial plot there. And this is a mound also. So sometimes you have amazing stories behind the words of where they come from. The same thing is true, by the way, lahavdil in English. I'm not going to give you a bunch of stories. I love language. I can give you a bunch of words in English that they have amazing stories behind them, but we're talking here about Hebrew. We're going to move on to a couple more names. I don't know if I'll get to both of them tonight. We'll see. Two men whose names should be emblazoned in your historical memory of modern day Jewish history. And each one deserves probably 3 or 4 months of classes. And I'm only going to do a few minutes on each one. Chaim Weizmann, and of course, the inimitable David Ben-Gurion. If we get to Ben-Gurion tonight, fine. If not, we'll see where we go. Chaim Weizmann. We could say that if Herzl founded political Zionism, Chaim Weizmann gave it a scientific, a diplomatic twist. He's born in the late 1800s. He lives to 1952. He's born in the city of Mutl. For those of you who are Chicagoans or former Chicagoans, you're familiar with the Mutl Shul. That's the city he was from, Mutl, in the Russian Pale of Settlement. He was educated in Germany. He was educated in Switzerland, where he gets his doctorate in organic chemistry. Now, usually I will not tell you when we talk about all these people, they got a degree in X. But this one becomes significant that he had his doctorate in organic chemistry because he was able to merge his technical expertise with political activism. He was originally, and we'll see why that makes a difference. He was originally a member of the Russian Chovavei Tzion network, which we mentioned before. He moves to England in 1904, and his career as a chemist brings him into contact with British elite. It is when you look at history, and you understand that history is not just a series of events, but it's Hashem's hand, sometimes overtly and sometimes behind the scenes. This is one of those where I could say it is, in retrospect, completely Hashem's hand, 100%. That he gets his doctorate in organic chemistry. He, for some reason, after being learning in Germany and learning in Switzerland, then he emigrates to England in 1904. He begins a career as a chemist in England, and for whatever reason, he was so well known and so sought after, he comes in contact with some of the upper crust of the British. his personality. He was this persuasive individual. He was a good speaker. Ends up making him as an intermediary between those with Zionist aspirations, all these names of people we've been talking about before tonight, all these aspirations and the power of Western politics, they start to intermingle. He becomes the go-between between them because he becomes well known. And what happens is, in World War I, his scientific work on bacterial fermentation of acetone, which was necessary for British munitions, earns him access to the highest level of government. He uses that leverage. When you have the leverage at key points in history, whether it's the individual whose name escapes me now that went into Truman right after Israel announced and convinces him he has to recognize them immediately, or Herzl, who runs around the globe trying to drum up support for Israel for some country and money and diplomacy, but they end up having all this access to the high level. He has high level access to the British government because he did something for the British war effort. He does this work that brings the acetone production to the British munitions for them to be able to use, and he uses that to advocate for Zionist inclusion in the British wartime policy. He has wonderful relationship with a name that you will know, a man named former Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour, who becomes known as Lord Balfour. And also another name, if you are familiar with the area of Emek Rafaim, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister. Many of those streets over there in Massareker, people were intimately involved in the pre-Israel state becoming a state. These two individuals, David Lloyd George and Arthur James Balfour, expressed support for national home. That's obviously for Jewish people in Palestine. That's the Balfour Declaration, which we're not going to talk about tonight. We're going to get back to that at some point. But his diplomacy, Weizmann's diplomacy, goes beyond wartime advocacy. He works to change, to influence a political practical gains in Israel. It's not yet called Israel, under British mandate. He envisioned institution building, economic development, and, shockingly, coexistence with Arab inhabitants. Pie in the sky idea. He often clashed with a more militant socialist Zionist, such as a man named David Ben-Gurion. His stature, though, as an elder statesman, made him the natural choice as Israel's first president in 1949. He personified the bridge between the Herzl diplomacy leading to statehood, meaning, whereas Herzl brought us to a certain point, beginning with the first Zionist Congress and all the hullabaloo that went with that and all the growth and everything else, and we have the Hebrew language, and we have Mochalaver, and we have Rav Reines, and we have Pinsker, we have all these names we've been talking about. Eventually, we have a state, which we're going to not be getting into now, obviously, not for the next few weeks. But he becomes this bridge that was like getting us over the goal line, so to speak, with all this background in history in the last 70 years, let's say 70, 80 years before. And he becomes eventually Israel's first president. But we'll do Bezrat Hashem next week. We'll talk about David Ben-Gurion, probably a little more in depth than I would have done had I done it tonight. And hopefully we will be able to see how he brings along with him. I'm not going to go through his entire history because I read a book last year. It's like this thick on David Ben-Gurion. It's really it's a lot written on him. I'll bring in as much as I can that makes it hopefully enjoyable, interesting, and we'll be able to see how this continues with the rest of our history.